it's Adam here for PC Monitors, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the AOC AG322QCX, which is a 32-inch model from the company's Agon gaming monitor lineup. It features a 32-inch VA panel, vertical alignment panel. It has a 2560 by 1440 or WQHD resolution, and it has a 1800R curve to the screen, which is fairly steep, but as I'll come on to shortly, isn't something I'd worry about, and it's something I find quite natural. The screen itself, having a 2560 by 1440 resolution and being 32 inches, that gives it a pixel density which is quite similar to a 24-inch 16 by 9 model, so text is a nice readable size for most users. I mean, it's not super high pixel density at all by modern monitor standards, but it's not too low either. I mean, it's a decent pixel density, and it's a good practical pixel density for this size of screen as well. So it gives you good potential for multitasking. If you've got sort of multiple applications open, perhaps multiple websites. I mean, personally, I don't know if it's just that I'm archaic, I prefer just having one website on the screen at once, but I do find the screen space particularly useful for things like Excel. You can have lots of cells on the screen at once and everything's nice and readable, perfectly sharp in my opinion, so it's good for work purposes, productivity, and just browsing the internet as well. And I'm going to take a quick look around the rear of the monitor. There's a little retractable headphone hook, which will be at the right side if you're looking at the monitor from the front. There is a stand mount position, which is 100 by 100 millimeter VESA or VESA compatible, depending on how you want to say it. You can replace that with another solution if you don't like the included stand. The included stand I quite like in terms of it being quite solid, quite robust, decent flexibility in terms of the adjustability, the adjustments you can make, It's powder coated metal, so it's pretty solid feel as well. It has these strips which I discuss in the OSD video. You can light them up in various different colours, red, green or blue, with different intensities as well. You don't really notice them from the front of the monitor, but if you can see the monitor from behind, then you can notice them. And again, they're not so bright that they really sort of light up the back of the monitor or anything like that either. There are some ports down here. My camera's not very good at macros, probably should have done this on my phone. You can see there is a little pink jack there, which is for a microphone. There's a headphone jack just next to it. There are two USB 3 ports, actually 3 USB 3 ports. One of them is a slightly different shape, slightly different connector type. I discussed this in the review. Can't remember off the top of my head exactly what it is because I'm not very good with USB ports, to be honest. It's not really my area. The first port has rapid charging functionality, which has a little lightning icon. I'm not sure if you can see that. Fast charging for connected devices, which is useful. There are two HDMI 1.4 ports. There is two DisplayPort 1.2A ports which support AMD FreeSync on compatible graphics cards. There's a VGA port, just an old legacy connection. I don't know why you'd be using VGA on this monitor. There is a 3.5mm audio input, 3.5mm microphone jack, another one. There is a mini USB port which you connect the included controller to. I don't have that out at the moment, but I'll show you that in the OSD video anyway. And there's a DC power input for the power connector, so it has an external power brick, this monitor. Finally, there is a Kensington lock slot. In terms of it being a VA panel, it has certain strengths, certain weaknesses. All monitors have strengths and weaknesses. This monitor isn't perfect, as I'll come on to in the review, but there's plenty to like about it as well. The screen surface, as you can perhaps see here, given that it's just changed to a nice dark background, It's matte, it's not glossy, you know, you can't see sharp reflections, but there is light striking the screen surface directly. That's not an ideal thing. I've got an anti-glare blind behind me, but a lot of light is coming through at the moment. It's just because of how I've positioned the monitor here to take the video. I usually wouldn't have any light source striking the screen, and you can see exactly why you want to avoid that. Because although it's matte anti-glare, it's also a sort of, as I call, relatively light matte anti-glare. So it doesn't have a particularly strong haze value, which is good because it means that the image is fairly clear. It's not particularly grainy for whites or light colours. But, I mean, it doesn't really matter what screen surface you've got on the monitor. You shouldn't really have bright light striking the screen directly. I've closed the curtains now so you can see the screen without the slightly annoying glare. The curve of the screen, I'd like to talk a little bit more about that now. It's 1800R, which is fairly steep, and because it's a 32-inch screen, it's got quite a fair screen space to take advantage of that curve. I actually quite like the curve. I've used a lot of curved monitors, and I think that people are unnecessarily put off the idea of curved screens because perhaps it's just something they're not used to. It's sort of an alien concept to them. But once you've actually see these firsthand with your own eyes, it's only then that you can really appreciate how the curve works and what it brings to the experience. But it's really quite a subtle addition. In the video, I'm not really sure how obvious the curve is in this video because it's taken from quite a sort of direct, straight-on viewing angle. But I know in some of the images you'll see of these curved monitors, they look a lot more curved and sort of the image almost looks distorted sometimes. But when you're actually in front of them using it, it really isn't. It just gives you a little bit of extra depth. It's really easy to adapt to. It's perfectly natural. And I just quite like it. I find it really quite comfortable, and it's just, yeah, I mean, there's a section in the written review which looks at this in more detail. And speaking of the written review, there is a link to that in the description of the video. There's also a link to information about how you can support the work that I do. So it's very important and something I really appreciate. So if you take some time to have a look at that, that'll be great. Rather than talk about the monitor too much on the desktop, I'd actually like to fire up some games. This is, after all, a gaming monitor, and as people who are familiar with my site and my channel will know, I do like a bit of PC gaming, and that's really what I like to focus on. But although I'll be talking about the characteristics of the monitor in games, it does all apply no matter what you're doing to the monitor. So I'll be talking about the colour reproduction, the contrast, the responsiveness. Although that's important to games, it's just as important outside of games. So without further ado, I will fire up Dirt Rally and talk a bit about the contrast performance of the monitor. I'm now on Dirt Rally, and I'm on a nice nighttime track. I like this game because it shows pretty dark nighttime environments. Some games have a sort of flooded look no matter how good the monitor is, but this one has a nice good dark night times, which is nice for showing off the contrast performance of the monitor. And as with anything you'll see on this video, you can't really get a good representation of how the monitor looks. What you see depends on your own monitor, depends on the processing done by my video editing software on YouTube, the camera as well. So this is just to give you sort of like, or to give me a prompt whilst I describe some of the characteristics of the contrast of this monitor. You probably see straight away the lighting is relatively uniform. It doesn't have issues with IPS glow because it's a VA panel. So with IPS panels, especially when they're this big, you have sort of patches of lightening, sort of a lightening grey rather than black, sort of towards the bottom corners in particular. And this floods the image. It is quite obvious, especially to users who don't like it. It's quite an obvious thing, and it really puts some people off IPS models. So it's nice not having that. It keeps things looking a bit more atmospheric, as I like to say. It does have a little bit of, sort of a tiny bit of glow towards the bottom. It's VA glow, vertical alignment glow, as I like to call it. So from a normal viewing position, it's nothing like IPS glow, and it doesn't have the same sort of detrimental impact on the image. It's something I explore a bit more in the written review as well. So in terms of the static contrast, I measured around 2000 to 1, which is roughly what's specified for this model as well. What that does is it gives you a sort of much deeper look to dark colours and allows brighter colours to sort of really stand out against darker backgrounds nicely. Sort of non-VA panels, they tend to go up to around 1000 to 1, which is, essentially half as good as this. And I know some VA panels have much stronger contrast, especially sort of older ones or slower ones. It maybe can go up to 5000 to 1 or so, but even so, this has a very distinct VA quality to it. It has a nice atmosphere, and again, because there's no IPS glow, in dark areas such as this, there's a good amount of detail, like the detail on the brickwork, the vegetation, that sort of thing. It's all very good. Being a VA panel, it does have something called black crush, and this is a bit difficult to show on this particular scene, and indeed it's actually quite difficult to show on a video in general without moving the camera around. So I've got it nicely fixed on the tripod, and I don't want to do that right now, so I'll just describe it instead. It's something that's described in the review, but because of the gamma characteristics of VA panels, you actually get less detail in the centre of the screen than towards the edges if you're looking at it directly from a normal viewing position, or if you look at it from the side, you'll actually see a greater amount of detail. It happens that dark shades tend to sort of blend into a black mass in the middle of the screen. This is something that's referred to as black crush quite commonly. This monitor does indeed have some of that, but it's really not very bad. I mean, I've seen it much worse on VA models, and again, I don't feel that this sort of, yes, it does reduce the detail levels a bit from what they ideally would be in dark scenes, but I do feel that the overall atmosphere it creates, this monitor overall is very good for dark scenes, and I don't feel that it's anywhere near as distracting as IPS glow. And even TN models aren't perfect in this respect because of the gamma shifts. They actually will have some sections of the screen looking quite flooded, whereas others look really dark, especially higher up. So, no LCD monitor's perfect, and this is the bit of a quirk that VA has. So there's not too much more to say about the contrast. I mentioned the screen surface before when I was on the desktop, and the sort of implications that has. It's not the lightest matte screen surface you'll see, and there's a little bit of graininess to white and light colours, but it's not too bad at all. It's not like a heavy smeary graininess which really annoys me personally, and I know annoys quite a few other users. So the screen surface is quite decent really. So I'm not going to bore you too much more about contrast. I'm going to fire up Battlefield 1 and talk a little bit about colour reproduction now. I'm now on Battlefield 1, and I'm going to talk a bit about the colour reproduction of the monitor. Overall, it's very pleasing actually, not just because of the sort of typical VA characteristics. The contrast actually helps a bit with that. You'll notice that lots of in games and just looking at images more generally, there's sort of an intricate mixture of a light and dark shades, and the contrast does help the lighter shades stand out nicely against the darker shades, and it helps the darker elements sort of appear more defined as well. And I know I wasn't really supposed to be talking about contrast, so before I witter on too much more, I'll quickly look at some nice colours instead. So the colour gamut of this monitor, which defines how saturated colours can look, is very impressive actually. It's not a wide gamut model in the traditional sense. It doesn't cover Adobe RGB or anything like that, but it does very generously cover sRGB with some good extension beyond that as well. So it gives you some extra vibrancy in games like this. Technically, many shades are more saturated than they should be, but it's not the sort of garish oversaturation you get with wide gamut models displaying this sort of content, which is designed more for the sRGB colour space games and stuff. So it gives a nice rich look to lots of colours. It's actually quite impressive, the colour gamut, because when I first measured it I thought this model probably actually uses quantum dots for the backlight, but AOC have confirmed that it doesn't. It just uses enhanced phosphors and sort of a normal white LED without any quantum dot trickery. Sorry, yeah, not trickery, any quantum dots going on anywhere. So, I mean, the colour gamut's very similar to quantum dot models I've tested, such as various ones from Samsung, so I'm very impressed with what they've done there without using quantum dots. So the blue and the red on this flag is very rich, very vibrant. There's lots of nice eye-catching greens as well, and a really nice variety of shades. The consistency of colours on this screen, it's much better than any TN model. It's actually a lot better than the some of the ultra-wides I've used recently as well, some of the VA ultra-wides, particularly the AOC AG322QCX model. The consistency is quite a lot better. Being a VA model, it's not perfect. It's not like an IPS type panel where you'll have a given shade, like a given shade of green, and it'll look pretty much the same centrally versus sort of the far edge of the screen or the very bottom of the screen. There is a loss of saturation because there's a lowering of gamma, perceived gamma, from a normal viewing position, which means that shades do lose a bit of saturation towards the edges of the screen and the bottom of the screen, but it's fairly, it's not particularly pronounced, and certainly not pronounced enough that I really notice it when gaming. I mean, it's so subtle in fact that you won't really be able to see it on the video. I mean, most shades provide a good amount of richness throughout the screen, and certainly where your eyes will be focusing on, the sort of central bulk of the screen, it's really very nice, sort of vibrant look to the image, far from being washed out. Different shades have this to a different extent. Some of the sort of more brown shades, for example, if I was on a sort of desert map, I might be able to show you this on the video a bit. The saturation loss is a bit more pronounced. I'm trying to see if I can see it on this wall. Again, I mean, it partly depends on the viewing distance as well. If you're closer, then the changes are more pronounced. But it's a fairly large monitor, and from the sort of viewing distance I like to be from the screen, which is sort of around 80 centimeters or so, it's not too pronounced at all. So yeah, it's there, and some users who are sensitive to it, they might notice it. And yes, it's a negative, but in my view, it's not too bad at all, especially not for a VA panel. So you're left with lots of nice vibrant looking shades, a good variety of shades. So really there's a lot to like about the colour reproduction. And I'd just like to point out again that what you see on the video, again, depends on your own monitor. It depends on the processing done on the video, my camera, blah blah blah. It's not a good representation of what you actually see. So yeah, I mean, I can see with this bush, for example, it looks a bit less saturated, a bit less vibrant if I'm looking at it towards the edge of the screen. But again, not a huge difference. So lots of boxes ticked for the monitor in terms of colour reproduction then. So I mean, again, this is a game, but a lot of this applies more broadly. So I wouldn't use this model, this monitor, or any VA model for that matter, if you're doing colour critical work, because although the changes in saturation and gamma are subtle, they're still there, and they do affect the accuracy of the shade reproduction. So even if you have it calibrated for perfect accuracy in the centre of the screen, yeah, it's not going to be exactly the same shade being displayed elsewhere on the screen. I'm now going to talk a bit about responsiveness on this monitor. As you can see here, there's a cutscene on a game. It's Battlefield 1, and you can probably see from the camera that there's a sort of constant flickering. That's something which happens on all FreeSync models. It's not specific to this monitor, and it's not something that I noticed outside of sort of very low frame rates, for example in cutscenes, or you know, when the animation's pretty much paused, so the frame rate's effectively 0 or very low. So I don't have any concerns about flickering more broadly on this monitor, but I just thought I'd point that out at the start, because I know a few people are not aware of this issue, and it can get a little bit annoying. I'm now on the game itself, and I've got it set to very low graphics settings, just so I can show you, or at least talk about the full potential of the monitor in terms of responsiveness. It's not, again, like all sections of this video, it's not something you can actually see yourself on the video, because that depends on your own monitor, what you're seeing. It depends on my camera, it depends on YouTube and all of that. It certainly isn't a 144 frames a second video anyway, it's a 50 frames a second video at most. So in no way does this represent what I'm actually seeing, so I'm just going to have to talk you through things. The first thing you'll notice when you use a high refresh rate monitor like this, especially one with low latency, I'll mention now that this monitor doesn't have a big problem with input lag, so things feel very responsive. So certainly in terms of what you feel, it feels very different to a 60 Hz monitor. This feeling does depend on the frame rate as well. If you're running the game at, say, 60 frames a second, it's not actually going to feel different to a 60 Hz monitor. For this advantage, you do need a high frame rate as well. So it's something that I call connected feel. I refer to in the written reviews as connected feel. You just sort of feel more attuned to the game. Your mouse inputs, your controller inputs just translate more quickly to action on the screen. That's because the monitor is outputting a lot more information every second compared to what a 60 Hz monitor can do. This also lowers the perceived blur. So when you move your character around, again you won't be able to see this from the video, but things just appear considerably sharper, less blurry, and that gives you a nice competitive edge in terms of being able to sort of spot enemies and what's going on in sort of frantic scenes in a game. So it's certainly those two things together, the connected feel and the lowered perceived blur, very nice. As with the connected feel, the perceived blur does depend on the frame rate. It's lowest at higher frame rates, so the highest potential for this monitor would be at 144 frames a second, which would match 144 Hz. I mean, at the start of this video I'm actually going to talk more about positive aspects of responsiveness. For the lighter transitions, and most transitions that you'll see on games, especially during the daylight, they're actually performed very quickly on this monitor. I've got it set up as per the written review, and I explore this in a lot more detail in the written review, but essentially it does perform most of the pixel transitions fast enough for a very good 144 Hz performance. So, you know, it looks and feels very much like a 144 Hz monitor for the most part. There are some weaknesses, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that by showing you some darker scenes, because the greatest, most noticeable weaknesses on this model occur with some darker shades involved in the transition, and you don't get too many of them in scenes like this, but I mean, if you look at the, you won't be able to see it on the video necessarily, but if I go inside it's a bit darker. I can now see some more sort of powdery trails. There's a little bit of overshoot as well. There's a sort of green, slight green glow around the rug there, but nothing that really catches the eye, certainly not at these high frame rates and high refresh rates. So really there's a lot to like about the sort of general responsiveness of the monitor, but I'm now going to move on to a less forgiving scene, again on Battlefield 1, but one in the dark, which will show off some of the weaknesses on this model. Again, I can show you a nice flickery cutscene, and I'll just discuss what exactly this is going to be showing. This Battlefield 1 scene is from Lawrence of Arabia, part of the campaign, part 2, which is called Nothing Is Written, in case people want to check out what it looks like on their own monitor or whatever. It's one I've used particularly for VA models recently that I've reviewed, because it does highlight some very nice weaknesses, or not so nice weaknesses, which all VA models have to some extent, some more than others. I'll just skip on to the game now. Again, the frame rate, at least initially, is going to be very high, because I've got the got things set up that way. So this sort of shows the maximum potential of the monitor again. And you can see there isn't flickering now, it's not a cutscene anymore, it's sort of rendered using the in-game graphics now, so it's at a good high frame rate. I mean, already you might be able to pick out some weaknesses, but I'll certainly talk about them in a bit more detail as I get to them in the game itself. Just sort of waiting for it to load up now. Although this scene is particularly unforgiving, and it's fair to say most games have a mixture of scenes that are like this, and ones that have predominantly lighter pixel transitions, which the monitor's much better at. You know, there are some games, I know some people do play games that are predominantly dark, and certainly the sort of weaknesses I'm showing you here are ones to bear in mind if you like to play that kind of game. So it's finally about to get me into the game, get some action going. I mean, you can probably see already, I do this sort of, I like to strafe around the horse at the start of this on lots of the monitors I test, and sometimes on some VA models you'd actually see a really distinct smearing behind the horse or around the horse. Something I like to call break-up trailing, which I'll explain only if I see some a bit later on. But on this model there's actually, I don't know if you can see it on the camera, there's a sort of a very, very slight sort of ghostly glow around the horse. It's only very slight, that's actually very mild overshoot. But in terms of the pixel transitions, they're not so bad actually. You know, there's not a distinct smearing. If you look at the saddle area, you might be able to pick up a bit of sort of more extended trailing compared to what you'd ideally see. But really for a VA model, this isn't so bad in my view. On some models as well, if you sort of move the character around and look at the moon, you'll have noticeable overshoot. Again, that's not happening on this model. So really, so far, the weaknesses don't seem to be as in your face as they are on some models, some VA models even, which is very good. Now, you can see a little bit of what I was referring to before as break-up trailing. It might even be a little bit of overshoot on this model. If you look at the sort of nice rock structures in the background there, there's a little kind of bright blue glow. It's again quite subtle on this monitor. It doesn't really catch the eye when you're just playing the game. On some models, even some of the 100Hz ultra-wides, that would actually be more distinct. And they're actually some of the stronger VA performers overall. So, you know, there's not really anything that really catches the eye when you're just playing the game, even on these weaker transitions. I think perhaps the most noticeable thing would be the sort of overshoot or the smearing around the, well, not smearing exactly, but the slight sort of purple glow you can see around the blacks on the telegraph wires. But again, I mean, it's not too extreme. You can certainly notice it. You can probably even pick it up on the video. But you know, there aren't sort of the massive weaknesses that you'll see on some VA models. That's basically how things are at high frame rates. You know, really, this monitor puts in a very solid 144Hz performance. As I mentioned, I do have FreeSync running, so I'm going to run you through a few things about what that does and how that changes the experience. I'm going to turn the graphics settings up to ultra. Actually, I'll just have them on automatic. It's mainly ultra anyway on my graphics card I'm using at the moment. So you can now see that the frame rate's dropped to around 90 frames a second. It will fluctuate a bit. Because I've got FreeSync enabled, the monitor actually matches that frame rate with its refresh rate, so it's going to be running at around 80 Hz or 81 Hz, whatever, you know, matching the frame rate exactly. Very nice. If I didn't have FreeSync, or you don't have FreeSync enabled, you'd get obvious stuttering if you had VSync enabled. It's basically some frames are rendered, displayed for longer than they should be, so they're duplicated, and that gives essentially a pause in the game, and so it'll sort of show one frame for too long and then skip to the next frame, and it looks a bit messy. It's not a nice thing, certainly if you're sensitive to it like I am, not a nice thing at all. Likewise with tearing, if you have VSync disabled, instead of the stuttering, you'll get tearing. Different sections of the screen are displaying different frames at the same time. And even if you don't notice the distinct tear lines, the tear lines themselves are actually less distinct at higher frame rates as well. But you will still notice a juddering, or certainly sensitive users such as myself, they will notice a distinct juddering, which is very off-putting. With FreeSync on, you don't get any of this, so it's definitely a nice thing. However, although it is a nice thing, it's still nicer to have the highest possible frame rates. I discussed this at some length in the written review, so I'm not going to bore you to death with it now. But FreeSync doesn't stop low frame rates being low frame rates. It just stops the stuttering and tearing that can come with the mismatches between frame rate and refresh rate. Another thing is, as I explore more in the written review, this monitor's overdrive doesn't work as well at lower frame rates. Certainly if you leave it on medium, which works best at higher frame rates, it's not as well balanced. Overshoot becomes more obvious, so it's running at just under 100 frames a second at the moment, and even then you can see this overshoot around the telegraph post is a bit more obvious. I can now see what I call a kind of trail of snail slime around the post itself. I'm just going to take these guys out and then I'll continue talking. And actually, now this vehicle's here, it might show you some more obvious examples of overshoot. And this is something which, if you didn't have FreeSync enabled, unfortunately it's not easy for me to disable FreeSync. I mean, I could restart the video with FreeSync disabled, but I can't really be bothered to do that. I'd rather you just take my word for it. This isn't linked to frame rate, it is linked to refresh rate. So if you have FreeSync disabled, the responsiveness in terms of the overshoot and all of that, it's very much like it is at 144 Hz, so it's not really a big problem. But with FreeSync, the refresh rate changes along with the frame rate, and you can probably see some more obvious overshoot now, some quite strong sort of colourful green trailing around there, for example. The frame rate's actually dropped further now to closer to 60 frames a second, so the overshoot becomes even stronger. I'm going to show you something a bit extreme. If I increase the resolution scale a bit, that should further decrease the frame rate. It's now running at just under 40 frames a second. I should mention that this monitor does support LFC, low frame rate compensation, and this allows the monitor to have a frame rate, its refresh rate, which will stick to a multiple of the refresh rate, because the lower limit of FreeSync on the hardware side, it wouldn't be able to display 38 Hz, but it can double that with its refresh rate, and that keeps the tearing and the stuttering at bay. But again, these very low frame rates like this, the whole feel and the look of the monitor is nothing like it is at higher frame rates. And again, you get some issues with overshoot being a bit more pronounced. You can probably see, I can see at least an obvious trail of snail slime, as I like to call it, around these telegraph posts. I find it quite jarring. This is something that FreeSync monitors in general are worse at than G-Sync monitors. With G-Sync, the pixel overdrive is sort of usually quite carefully tuned by NVIDIA as well as the monitor manufacturer, so that regardless of the frame rates or the refresh rate that the monitor is running at, that it actually optimizes the pixel responsiveness quite well for that specific refresh rate. But FreeSync monitors, they just tend to sort of work best at higher frame rates. I mean, there are exceptions. It's just that some monitors have very good overdrive, which is well tuned anyway, regardless of the refresh rate. But most of them are a bit like this, and at lower frame rates, you do notice more obvious overshoot. So I think I've really whittled on for long enough, especially in this second section of the responsiveness video. Again, this is just a sort of small look at the monitor to sort of reinforce some of the ideas in the written review. So to wrap up then, as with any monitor I review, because I'm what some people would call an enthusiast, some people call me a professional reviewer, although I'm not really sort of officially paid to review monitors, so I don't really consider myself a professional in that sense. You know, I've got a keen eye for things. I have tested hundreds of monitors and reviewed, you know, a lot of them on YouTube now as well. And I know I've got a keen eye. I'll notice things that most sort of average users, if there is such a thing, won't notice. And as with any monitor, you know, no monitor's perfect. I will pick up negative points, I will highlight them, and that doesn't mean it's a bad monitor. You know, as I said, no monitor's perfect. With this model, there is a lot I like about it and some things I dislike about it. And I think on balance, there's more I do like than I don't like. I find the large curved screen works nicely. I find it very comfortable, very natural to look at. It is perfectly comfortable for me to use on my desk. I don't have the deepest desk in the world. I mean, it's pretty deep, but it's you know, there are deeper desks out there. And for my normal viewing position or distance, which sort of varies between maybe 70 to 85 centimeters, depending on how I'm sitting, I find it absolutely fine. The WQHD 2560 by 1440 resolution works nicely as well. It doesn't give you a super high pixel density. It's quite similar to a 24-inch Full HD model in that respect. So, you know, it's a respectable pixel density. It's not great by modern standards, but certainly isn't awful either. It's pretty decent, is really how I'd look at it. It also allows you a lot of real estate on the desktop. Some good working space, certainly compared to Full HD models, and if you're upgrading from a Full HD or lower resolution model, this will feel like a really nice upgrade in that respect as well. The contrast, it's really much as I'd expect from recent VA models I've tested. It does have strong static contrast. I mean, it's not super strong, you know, it doesn't have like really inky dark colours and really inky blacks. Certainly if you're viewing in a dark room, you will notice that, but you'll also notice that the contrast is significantly stronger than it is on other LCD panel types. So it definitely has a distinct VA flavour to it, so that's good. Colour reproduction, again, that's a bit of a mixed bag with VA models, but this one is, the panel used itself is actually quite impressive in that respect. For one thing, the colour gamut is actually as wide as I've seen on some models that use quantum dots. And I mean, quantum dots is a wonderful marketing thing, but all it really does is extend the colour gamut of the monitor. And this one just uses enhanced phosphors. I've got an article all about it's called The Evolution of LED Backlights, or something like that, and that shows, it talks about all of this in some detail. So this is just a sort of ordinary LED backlight with special doped enhanced phosphors, and that gives it a nice colour gamut without even needing quantum dots. You know, I'm not saying this is advantageous over having quantum dots, it's just a different solution to sort of achieve similar end results. You know, it basically gives nice vibrant colours. It does give a bit of extra saturation in places, so colours aren't you know, entirely accurate in that respect, but I think most users actually quite like this. It's again, on the point of colour accuracy, I wouldn't recommend any VA model for colour critical work. Maybe hobbyist photography and that kind of thing, you can get away with it. And this model is actually quite good in that respect, in that it has fairly good colour consistency for such a large VA model. There is a loss of saturation towards the bottom of the screen and the sides of the screen. And if you're sitting particularly close to the monitor, perhaps 60 centimetres or below, you might notice this more. But for my viewing distance, this actually wasn't at all extreme, and it was actually probably the least pronounced I'd seen on a VA model. So what this means is, in games you have colours that look more consistently rich across the screen and up and down the screen, and it also means that colours are more accurately represented if you've got it calibrated for the centre of the screen. When you compare that shade with the more peripheral sections of the screen, it'll look quite similar, but it isn't at IPS type levels in that respect, so there definitely are some changes in gamma and saturation levels for shades. So if you are using this for colour critical work, just be aware of that. But for everyone else, for general purpose use, I think this works very nicely, and overall I found the colour reproduction pretty impressive. In terms of responsiveness, to put it bluntly, it's very good, especially for a VA panel, for a monitor that uses a VA panel. It has some weaknesses, like all VA models, and those weaknesses aren't as pronounced. I think the most pronounced weaknesses, in my view, really happen at the lower frame rates, or more specifically the lower refresh rates if you've got FreeSync enabled, or if you just select a static refresh rate that's lower for whatever reason. But in terms of its high frame rate performance, I found it very impressive. And yes, again, there are some weaknesses, especially for some darker transitions, but nothing that I view as particularly extreme or widespread for this VA panel. And I mean, I've been reviewing a BenQ PD3200U sort of between models. As in between units, I've actually reviewed 2 units of this particular model because they'd corrected an issue with one of the pre-production ones they gave me early on. It wasn't running properly at 144 Hz. That's now being corrected. It'll be corrected for all retail samples, so that's fine. But basically, I've been using the 60 Hz monitor, one with very good pixel overdrive for 60 Hz, no real problems, but I really did miss the high frame rates and high refresh rates that this monitor can deliver. I mean, I did miss FreeSync as well, although, for some of the time I've been using my NVIDIA card anyway, so it really, the high refresh rate alone is really a very nice thing, and this monitor does couple it with really quite good responsiveness in my view overall, so that is good. What else? The build quality I find quite decent. It's fairly solidly built. I know you can't really see in the dark video. I'll just open the curtains a bit because I think it's a bit silly to talk about build quality when you can hardly see what I'm actually talking about. The curtains are now open, so you can actually see the outside of the monitor a bit. I find it pretty inoffensive. I don't love the style of it. I don't really like glossy black bezels myself, and there's quite a big black bezel at the bottom. The side of the screen and the edges, that's fine. I'm fairly unfussed about that. The stand, the fact it's powder coated metal gives it a nice solid feel. It's got good weight to it. I quite like that. The design, again, I don't love it, but I'll just move the camera down a little bit. So, the shape of the stand, it's all right. I find it a bit deep. I would have preferred a slightly shallower design. It goes quite far back. These are all things I mention in more detail in the written review, and actually the written review mentions quite a few things that I didn't even have time to really talk about in this video review. I know it's already been a lot longer than some of you would have wanted from a monitor review or any review of any product really, and I can appreciate it can be very hard to concentrate for this long. So if you've made it that far, thank you very much for listening. I would definitely, perhaps when you've had a bit of a tea or coffee break or whatever, if you haven't already read the written review, I definitely recommend doing that. There are some things that are talked about there which aren't even discussed here, like uniformity, interlaced pattern artifacts, various things discussed in a lot more detail than I've done in this sort of brief overview. There's a link to that in the description of the video. There's also a link to how you can support the work I do on YouTube and on my website pcmonitors.info in the description of this video as well. Thanks for listening.